The radio crackle cut through the operations center like a scalpel through silence. 4 words that made every heart in the room freeze. Winchester, bingo fuel, defensive. The transmission came from Viper Flight, 4 F-16s deep in hostile territory, their sleek silhouettes painted across the thermal displays like dying stars. They'd been tasked with suppressing enemy air defenses along the mountain corridor, but intelligence had miscalculated. The valley wasn't defended by obsolete systems and scattered militias. It was a killing field, bristling with modern S-400 batteries, mobile launchers, and a coordinated network that had been waiting, watching, learning American patterns for months. Now Viper Flight was hemorrhaging countermeasures, jinking through missile contrails, their fuel gauges dropping into red as they burned precious JP-8 evading death at Mach speeds. The lead pilot's voice carried the controlled terror of a man who'd done the math and knew the numbers didn't add up. Any station, Viper lead declaring emergency. Multiple SAM sites active. We are Winchester all ordnance bingo fuel state, request immediate support. The operations center erupted into controlled chaos, voices overlapping as controllers pulled up satellite feeds, calculated response times, assessed available assets. F-15s were 30 minutes out. Too far. Apache gunships were engaged in another sector. The carrier battle group's Hornets were being held in reserve for a developing situation in the Strait. Every fast mover with enough gas and weapons was already committed, already burning across other sectors of sky in this sprawling, multi-front engagement that had consumed the entire theater for 6 days straight. Then a different voice cut through the radio traffic, calm as a mountain lake, carrying an accent that suggested open prairies and endless horizons. Viper lead, Halo 2-1, I'm 20 clicks southwest, Angels 8, full load of 30 mic and a full bag of gas. There was a pause, the kind of pause that carries weight, the kind that makes people stop and listen. I've got eyes on your contrails. Give me your coordinates and I'll come get you. In the operations center, 3 junior officers exchanged glances. The name on their screens read, Captain Kestrel Brennan, call sign Halo, flying an A-10 C Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, that ugly, beloved, impossibly slow beast of close air support that had no business anywhere near modern integrated air defenses. Someone laughed nervously. Another muttered about suicide. The wing commander leaned forward, studying the display, watching the slow-moving icon representing Halo 2-1 as it began turning toward the coordinates Viper lead was transmitting in desperate, clipped numbers. The A-10 on his screen crawled across the map at a fraction of the speed of the F-16s, vulnerable, exposed, heading straight toward the missile storm like a moth toward an inferno. But he didn't call her back. Kestrel Brennan had been hearing that nervous laughter her entire career, that subtle undertone of doubt whenever her name appeared on a mission roster. She'd grown up in Wyoming, learned to fly in a Cessna 152 held together with stubbornness and prayer, joined the Air Force because the sky called to her with a voice that drowned out every other ambition. She'd fought for her slot in fighter training, outperformed half her class, then been quietly shuffled toward the A-10 pipeline because someone in personnel decided that women belonged in ground support, not air superiority. She'd carried that decision like a stone in her chest for years, until the first time she'd saved a convoy pinned down by insurgent fire, until she'd heard the pure gratitude in a ground commander's voice as she rolled in with her gun singing that unmistakable BRRRRT that meant salvation was inbound. The A-10 had become more than an aircraft to her. It was proof that slow and steady could outlast fast and flashy, that survivability trumped speed, that being underestimated was sometimes the sharpest weapon in your arsenal. She'd logged over 2,000 hours in the Warthog, learned every trick, every quirk, every way to coax impossible performance from those twin turbofans. She knew the airplane would take punishment that would tear other aircraft apart, that its titanium bathtub could absorb fire that would core out an F-16's fuselage. She trusted her aircraft the way some people trusted God, with a faith earned through experience and tested in fire. Now she scanned her instruments with practiced efficiency, her hands moving across switches and controls with the unconscious grace of a concert pianist. Her wingman, Lieutenant Marcus Reeves, call sign Dice, pulled into formation off her right wing, his voice coming through the radio with forced casualty that didn't quite hide his tension. "Halo, you sure about this? Those are S-400s down there. They'll splash us before we get within gun range." Kestrel checked her countermeasures, confirmed her defensive systems were armed and ready, then keyed her mic with one gloved finger. "Dice, those boys are out of options and out of time. We're the only game in town." She paused, watching the mountains rise ahead, their peaks dusted with snow that caught the late afternoon sun like scattered diamonds. Besides, nobody expects the Warthog. There was dark humor in that statement, gallows humor, the kind that military aviators used to paper over the fear that lived in every mission brief, every launch, every moment when you strapped yourself to tens of thousands of pounds of metal and explosives, and hurled yourself toward people who very much wanted to kill you. Dice laughed, short and sharp. "Roger that, I'm with you." They descended through 8,000 feet, the altimeter unwinding as they dropped below the mountain peaks, using terrain masking to hide their approach. Kestrel flew with the smooth precision of someone who'd spent years reading thermals and wind patterns, someone who understood that in the A-10, you didn't muscle the airplane, you danced with it. The Warthog responded to her inputs like an old friend, banking gently as she threaded through a valley, the aircraft's twin engines purring with reassuring power. The terrain racing beneath her wings was hostile in every sense, rough, mountainous, dotted with villages that could hide anything from refugees to anti-aircraft batteries. Her radar warning receiver stayed quiet for now, but she knew that would change the moment they crested the ridgeline and entered the combat zone proper. Viper Lead's voice came through again, more strained now, the professional calm beginning to crack. "Any support, Viper Lead, we're down to emergency fuel. 2 aircraft have battle damage. We need immediate assistance." Kestrel could hear the background noise in his transmission, warning tones, the frantic beeping of missile alerts, the sound of a cockpit in crisis mode. She imagined him in his ejection seat, hands tight on the stick, watching his fuel gauge hover just above empty while his radar warning receiver screamed about threats from every direction. The F-16s were designed for speed and agility, for dominating the high-altitude arena where thrust-to-weight ratios and turning rates decided who lived and who became a smoking crater. Down here in the weeds, surrounded by mountains and mobile SAM sites, they were fish out of water, burning fuel they didn't have to stay alive. "Viper Lead, Halo 2-1, I'm 5 minutes out. I need you to paint those SAM sites with your targeting pod if you've got anything left in the tank. Give me coordinates and laser designation." There was a pause, then Viper Lead came back, and Kestrel could hear the cautious hope bleeding into his voice. "Halo, be advised, multiple threats. We've identified at least 6 launcher positions, possibly more. They're mobile, they're coordinated, and they're very good at what they do." Kestrel smiled, though no one could see it behind her oxygen mask, inside her helmet, alone in her cockpit with the mountain walls sliding past her canopy. "Copy all, Viper Lead. That's what the gun is for." She pulled back on the stick, climbing just enough to clear the ridgeline, and the valley opened before her like a vision from a tactical nightmare. Smoke trails crisscrossed the sky, white contrails marking the paths of surface-to-air missiles that had been launched in salvos, hunting the F-16s with electronic determination. She could see the 4 fighters now, tiny silver crosses against the blue, weaving and jinking, leaving trails of countermeasure flares that blossomed like momentary fireworks. They were beautiful and desperate, locked in a dance with death, burning fuel and luck with every passing second. Below them, scattered across the valley floor and tucked into defiles, she could see the telltale signatures of SAM launchers, vehicles with elevated rails, radar dishes tracking their prey, the coordination centers that turned individual weapons into a networked web of destruction. This was what modern air defense looked like when it was done right: mobile, redundant, layered, designed to kill precisely the kind of fast-moving threats that the F-16s represented. But nobody had designed it to kill something like her. The A-10 wasn't fast enough to trigger the engagement parameters most SAMs were optimized for. Its heat signature was minimal compared to the afterburner-equipped fighters. It could fly low, hug the terrain, appear on radar like a slow-moving helicopter or a bird too large to be real. And most importantly, it could take hits that would down any other aircraft and keep flying, keep fighting, keep bringing that gun to bear. Kestrel armed her GAU-8 Avenger, the massive 7-barrel rotary cannon that formed the spine of her aircraft, built around a gun so powerful that the Air Force had essentially designed an airplane to carry it. 30mm rounds, depleted uranium penetrators, a rate of fire that could saw through armor and concrete, and anything else that had the misfortune to be under her nose when she pressed the trigger. She toggled through her weapon stations, confirming her Maverick missiles were ready, her Sidewinders armed for any airborne threats, her countermeasure pods loaded and active. Then she pushed the throttles forward and dropped into the valley like a hawk diving for prey. The radar warning receiver came alive immediately, threat indicators painting her displays with the signatures of multiple tracking radars, fire control systems locking onto her aircraft, preparing to launch. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. Instead, she activated her jamming pods, filled the electromagnetic spectrum with noise and deception, and dove toward the first SAM site she'd identified through the smoke and chaos. "Dice, take high cover, keep any air threats off my back. I'm going in." Her wingman rogered the call and climbed, positioning himself where he could watch the aerial picture while she went to work in the weeds. Kestrel lined up on the first launcher, a mobile unit that was frantically trying to reposition, its crew having realized too late that something new had entered their engagement zone. She could see people running near the vehicle, tiny figures scrambling for cover, and for a brief moment she thought about them. Someone's son, someone's brother, men who'd woken up this morning and eaten breakfast and checked weapons, and never imagined they'd be staring down the barrel of an A-10. Then she thought about Viper Lead and his wingmen, about pilots who were seconds away from flaming out over hostile territory, about the rescue missions that would be needed if they went down, about the cascade of violence that would follow. She steadied her pipper on the target, waited for the range to close, then pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life with a sound that defied description, a thunderous BRRRRT that shook her entire airframe, a sound that carried for miles, a sound that announced in no uncertain terms that judgment had arrived on twin turbofans and titanium armor. The first burst lasted 2 seconds, 70 rounds downrange, and the SAM launcher simply ceased to exist as a functional vehicle, torn apart by depleted uranium hitting at 3,000 feet per second. Explosions rippled across the site as unfired missiles cooked off, secondary blasts that sent smoke and debris fountaining into the sky. Kestrel pulled up, banking hard right, feeling the G-forces press her into her seat as she maneuvered for her next run. Her RWR was screaming now, multiple threats trying to achieve lock, but she stayed low, used the terrain, popped flares in a steady stream. Another missile streaked past her canopy, close enough that she could see its motor burning, then it lost track and corkscrewed into a hillside. She keyed her radio. "Viper Lead, Halo, I'm engaging the western sites first. Start your egress north, stay low, follow the river valley. I'll cover your 6. There was no acknowledgement for a moment, and Kestrel wondered if Viper Lead even believed this was happening, if he could process the sight of an A-10 wadding into a modern SAM network like it was a training exercise. Then his voice came back, tight but controlled. "Copy, Halo. Vipers are egressing north. We owe you a beer. Or 10. She didn't respond, too busy lining up her second target, another launcher that had made the fatal mistake of lighting her up with its fire control radar. That was the thing about radar. It was a two-way street. When you illuminated someone, you also told them exactly where you were. She ripple-fired 2 Mavericks, watched their rocket motors ignite, and the missiles leap from her wings, racing toward the target with infrared guidance that didn't care about jamming or countermeasures. Both missiles impacted within a second of each other, and the SAM sight disappeared in a fireball that sent a black mushroom cloud climbing into the evening air. 3 sights down. She counted at least 3 more in her immediate area. Dice called over the radio, his voice sharp with warning. "Halo, you've got a radar track, 6 o'clock high, looks like a fighter trying to get into position." She checked her displays, saw the contact, something fast-moving, probably a MiG-29, vectoring in to splash her while she was focused on ground targets. Classic air defense doctrine. Use the SAMs to force the enemy low and slow, then send in fighters to clean up. But they'd underestimated how much firepower she could bring to bear while also defending herself. "Dice, break right and engage. Keep him busy." Her wingman peeled off, his banking sharply as he moved to intercept the inbound threat. Kestrel trusted him to handle it. Reeves was young but solid, a good stick who'd proven himself in combat. She focused on the ground picture, on the remaining SAM sites that were now desperately trying to coordinate a response to this unexpected threat. The problem with modern integrated air defense was that it relied on coordination, on networked communications, on each node of the system talking to the others. Take out the communication nodes, and the network became a collection of individual units, easier to defeat in detail. She identified what looked like a command vehicle, more antennas, different radar signature, and rolled in on it with her gun. The BRRRRT sound echoed across the valley again, a sound that had terrified enemy forces since the Cold War, and the command vehicle shuddered under the impact of 30 mic rounds before exploding. Behind her she heard Dice call, splash one, the fighter is down," and she felt a fierce pride in her wingman, in the A-10 community that everyone dismissed until the shooting started. Viper lead transmitted again, his voice lighter now, almost disbelieving. "Halo, Vipers are clear of the kill zone, we're heading for tanker rendezvous. I don't know what the hell we just witnessed, but thank you, you saved our lives." Kestrel climbed out of the valley, her aircraft taking sporadic ground fire that pinged off her titanium bathtub without penetrating, and she thought about all the times she'd been dismissed, overlooked, assigned to boring patrols and low-priority missions because someone had decided the A-10 was obsolete. She thought about the fighter jocks who'd looked right through her at briefings, who'd called the Warthog a flying tank too slow to matter in modern warfare. She thought about proving them wrong, not with words, but with actions, with saves, with a gun run that turned the tide when everything else had failed. "Just doing my job, Viper lead. Get home safe." She formed up with Dice, checking his aircraft for battle damage. He had some holes in his tail, nothing critical. They turned for home together, 2 ugly aircraft flying low and slow, having just accomplished what faster, sleeker, more expensive platforms couldn't. The sun was setting behind them, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and Kestrel allowed herself a moment to appreciate the beauty of it, the way the light caught on the snow-capped peaks, the way the shadows lengthened across the valleys. Flying had always been about this for her. Not just the combat, not just the mission, but the pure joy of being aloft, of seeing the world from this perspective, of being part of the sky itself. They flew in silence for a while, the radio quiet except for occasional check-ins with controlling agencies, the business of war continuing around them but distant now, someone else's problem. Then Dice spoke, his voice thoughtful. "Halo, can I ask you something?" She smiled again, that hidden smile that lived inside her helmet. "Shoot." There was a pause, the kind where someone was weighing their words carefully. "Why do you call your bird Halo? I've always wondered." Kestrel looked down at her instrument panel, at the photographs taped to the edge. Her family, her golden retriever, a shot of her first solo flight in the Cessna back in Wyoming when the world had been young, and everything had seemed possible. The call sign had come from her first combat deployment, when she'd arrived at a forward operating base just as a medevac helicopter was taking fire during an extraction. She'd rolled in without orders, without clearance, just reacting to the radio chatter and the sight of tracers reaching up toward the helicopter. Her gun had silenced the enemy position in seconds, and the medevac had escaped without casualties. Afterward, one of the rescued soldiers had said she'd appeared like an angel from heaven, and the name had stuck, shortened to Halo, a call sign that carried weight because it represented who she was, someone who showed up when hope was fading, someone who brought salvation in the form of a 7-barrel rotary cannon. But she didn't say all that to Dice. Instead, she just keyed her mic and said, "Because someone has to be the guardian angel, and I figured it might as well be me." They flew on through the gathering dusk, 2 Warthogs heading home, and behind them in the operations center, a wing commander was already writing the after-action report that would make waves all the way to the Pentagon. The night came softly to the mountains, stars emerging one by one in the darkening sky, and somewhere in that vastness, 4 F-16 pilots were landing safely, alive because one A-10 driver had refused to let them die. That was the mission. That was always the mission. And tomorrow, Kestrel Brennan would wake up and do it all over again, because the sky was calling and she had always answered. The operations center had transformed by the time Kestrel and Dice touched down on the scarred runway of Forward Operating Base Sentinel. What had been controlled chaos during the rescue had settled into a different kind of intensity. The focused energy of analysts poring over mission recordings, intelligence officers updating threat assessments, commanders trying to understand how an A-10 had survived what should have been a suicide mission. Kestrel went through the post-flight routine with mechanical precision, inspecting her aircraft for battle damage, signing off on maintenance forms, debriefing with the intelligence team. Her Warthog had taken 17 hits, mostly small arms fire that hadn't penetrated anything critical, though one round had punched through a control surface and would require replacement. The maintenance chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Kowalski who'd been keeping A-10s flying since the first Gulf War, ran his hand along the patched holes and whistled low. "Ma'am, you took this bird dancing in a place she had no business being, and she brought you home. That's the hog for you." Kestrel nodded, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion settling into her bones, the adrenaline crash that always came after combat. "She's a good bird, Chief. Take care of her." He promised he would, already barking orders to his crew, and Kestrel walked across the flight line toward the debriefing rooms, her flight gear heavy on her shoulders, her helmet tucked under one arm. The night air was cool and dry, carrying the smell of jet fuel and desert dust, and overhead the stars were impossibly bright, untouched by light pollution this far from civilization. She paused for a moment, looking up at the Milky Way stretching across the sky like a river of light, and wondered what her younger self, the girl who'd learned to fly over Wyoming rangeland, would think of this moment. Probably something about dreams and destiny, about the path that had led from a tiny civilian airport to the cockpit of a combat aircraft flying missions that would be classified for years. The debriefing lasted 2 hours, an exhaustive review of every decision, every engagement, every second of the mission. The intelligence officers wanted to know about the SAM sites, the coordination she'd observed, the effectiveness of her countermeasures. The operations officer wanted to understand her tactics, how she'd approached the engagement, why she'd made the choices she'd made. And through it all, Kestrel spoke clearly and professionally, laying out her reasoning without drama or embellishment, because that was the job, not just flying the mission, but helping everyone learn from it, helping the institution get better at the impossibly complex task of modern warfare. When it was finally over, she walked out of the briefing room to find a small crowd waiting in the corridor. Viper Lead was there, still in his flight suit, his face drawn with exhaustion but his eyes bright. He stepped forward as she emerged, and for a moment they just looked at each other, 2 pilots who'd shared something that couldn't quite be put into words, a moment where life and death had hung in the balance and the balance had tipped toward life. Then he extended his hand, and when she took it, his grip was firm and warm. "Captain Brennan, I wanted to thank you properly. What you did today." "There aren't words." Kestrel shook her head slightly. "You'd have done the same for me." He laughed, short and honest. "Maybe, but I don't know if I'd have had the guts to fly an A-10 into an S-400 network. That was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen. She met his eyes steadily. Sometimes they're the same thing, Major. Sometimes you just do what needs doing and hope the airplane holds together. The other Viper pilots crowded around then, all of them wanting to shake her hand, to express gratitude that came from the deepest place a combat pilot could reach. The knowledge that they'd been saved from the nightmare scenario of ejecting over hostile territory, of capture or death, of never seeing home again. Kestrel accepted their thanks with grace, deflecting when she could, acknowledging when she couldn't, always trying to steer the conversation back to the team, to Dice, who'd kept the enemy fighter off her back, to the maintainers who'd kept her aircraft mission-ready. But she could see something shifting in their eyes, in the way they looked at her now. Before the mission, she'd been just another pilot, another name on the daily briefing slide, someone they'd probably never given much thought to. Now she was the person who'd saved their lives, and that created a bond that transcended rank or service or the tribal divisions between fighter communities. Word spread through the base with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By the time Kestrel made it to her quarters, a small containerized housing unit that she shared with another female pilot, everyone seemed to know what had happened. People she didn't know nodded to her as she passed. A group of ground troops loading supplies onto a truck stopped to watch her walk by, and one of them called out, "Nice work today, Captain," with genuine respect in his voice. She acknowledged them with a nod and kept walking, uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to let her flying speak for itself. Inside her CHU, she finally allowed herself to collapse onto her bunk, too tired to bother with a shower, too wired to actually sleep. Her roommate, a C-130 pilot named Lieutenant Jade Morrison, looked up from her laptop and whistled softly. "So you're the one everyone's talking about." The A-10 driver who went full Leroy Jenkins into a SAM network and somehow didn't die. Kestrel closed her eyes, letting the darkness behind her eyelids soothe her jangled nerves. "It wasn't that dramatic, Jade. Just another close air support mission." Jade laughed, the sound rich with disbelief. "Right, just another mission. That's why the wing commander personally called to ask how you were doing, and why there's already talk of a medal recommendation going up the chain. Face it, Kess, you're a hero whether you like it or not." The word made Kestrel uncomfortable, carrying as it did implications of exceptional courage or superhuman ability, when in reality she'd just been doing her job, applying her training, trusting her aircraft and her instincts. Heroes were supposed to be special, extraordinary, but she'd always believed that the real measure of a military professional was doing the ordinary things extraordinarily well, day after day, mission after mission, without fanfare or recognition. But she was too tired to argue, so she just grunted acknowledgement and let the silence settle around them. Sleep came eventually, fitful and filled with dreams of missile contrails and the sound of her gun, that distinctive BRRRRT that had become the soundtrack to her combat deployments. In her dreams, she was always flying, always searching for the next threat, always one trigger pull away from life or death. She woke before dawn, habit and internal clock overriding her exhaustion. The base was just stirring to life, the flight line illuminated by sodium lights that cast everything in harsh yellow shadows. She went for a run along the perimeter, her body protesting every step, but the movement helped clear her head, helped process the events of the previous day. The desert morning was cold, the sun not yet high enough to bake the moisture from the air, and her breath came in visible puffs as she ran. Other early risers passed her going the opposite direction, some of them double-taking when they recognized her, others simply focused on their own physical training. She pushed herself harder than usual, trying to outrun the restless energy that combat always left in her system, the hypervigilance that took days to fade. By the time she finished, the sun was cresting the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded her of Wyoming sunrises, of mornings spent helping her father with ranch work before school. She'd grown up understanding hard work and responsibility, had learned early that you didn't complain about the hand you were dealt. You just played it the best you could. That ethic had served her well in the military, where complaining changed nothing but your reputation. After a shower and breakfast, she reported for the daily briefing, sliding into her usual seat near the back of the room where the A-10 drivers congregated. The briefing room was packed, every seat filled, pilots and weapons systems officers and intelligence personnel all waiting for the day's tasking. The wing commander, Colonel Marcus Hayes, stepped to the front of the room, and the conversations died away into attentive silence. Hayes was a former F-15 driver, a man with more combat hours than most pilots would log in their entire careers, and he commanded respect through competence rather than rank. He scanned the room, his gaze finding Kestrel and holding for a moment, then he began the briefing. The tactical situation had changed overnight. The rescue mission had disrupted enemy air defense operations in that sector, forced them to consolidate and reposition, creating gaps in their coverage that coalition forces were already exploiting. Ground units were advancing through the corridor that Viper Flight had been tasked to open, and the air tasking order for the day reflected the shift: more close air support missions, more interdiction strikes against enemy logistics, the tempo of operations increasing as they pressed their advantage. When Hayes reached the A-10 portion of the briefing, he paused and looked directly at Kestrel. "Captain Brennan, your actions yesterday prevented the loss of 4 F-16s and their pilots. More than that, you demonstrated that the A-10 remains a relevant and potent platform in a contested environment. Your mission is being analyzed at every level of the Air Force, and I expect you'll be hearing from people considerably senior to me in the coming days." The room was silent, every eye on her, and Kestrel felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She hadn't flown the mission for recognition or medals or strategic impact. She'd done it because 4 pilots needed help, and she had the capability to provide it. But she understood that Hayes was doing this publicly for a reason, was making a point about the value of the A-10 community at a time when budget hawks and procurement officers were constantly trying to retire the platform. She nodded acknowledgement, and Hayes continued with the briefing, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. There was an energy now, a sense that something significant had happened, that the narrative about what was possible in modern air warfare had been rewritten. When the briefing concluded, Kestrel found herself surrounded by other A-10 pilots, all of them wanting to know the details that hadn't made it into the official account, wanting to understand her tactics so they could apply them in future missions. She spent an hour walking them through her decision-making process, emphasizing the importance of terrain masking, of using the enemy's own radar against them, of trusting the aircraft's survivability when speed wasn't an option. They listened with the intensity of professionals learning from someone who just survived what they might face tomorrow, and Kestrel felt a responsibility to share everything she knew, to help them survive their own impossible missions. Dice found her afterward, his expression serious in a way that made her pause. "Halo, we got today's tasking. They want us back in the same area, flying combat air patrol while the ground units advance." She studied his face, seeing the concern there, the awareness that they were being sent back into a hornet's nest that was now fully alert to their tactics. "You good with that?" He met her eyes and nodded slowly. "If you're flying, I'm flying. But I won't lie, yesterday scared the hell out of me. I kept thinking we were about to become smoking holes in the desert." Kestrel appreciated his honesty, the willingness to admit fear without letting it control him. That was the mark of a good combat pilot, not the absence of fear but the ability to function despite it, to compartmentalize and focus on the mission. "It scared me too, Dice. Every mission scares me a little. The day it doesn't, I'll know it's time to hang up my wings." They walked to the flight line together, going through their pre-flight inspections with careful attention to detail, because complacency killed more pilots than enemy action. Chief Kowalski had been true to his word. Kestrel's aircraft had been patched and serviced, every system checked and rechecked, ready for another day of war. The mission brief was straightforward on paper: provide on-call close air support for advancing ground forces, respond to any threats that emerged, maintain air superiority in the lower altitude bands where faster aircraft couldn't effectively operate. In reality, it meant flying hours of boring circles at medium altitude, burning fuel, staying alert, waiting for something to happen while hoping nothing would. Kestrel strapped into her cockpit, the familiar confines of the A-10 wrapping around her like a second skin, every switch and control exactly where muscle memory expected it to be. She went through her startup checklist with methodical precision, listening to the twin turbofans spool up with their characteristic whine, feeling the aircraft come alive under her hands. The tower cleared them for takeoff, and she rolled down the runway, feeling the moment when the Warthog lifted off the concrete, and she was flying again, free of the earth, back where she belonged. They climbed to altitude and settled into their patrol pattern, the ground forces visible below as they advanced through the mountain corridor, a long column of vehicles kicking up dust plumes that marked their progress. The radio chatter was constant but routine. Logistics coordination, situation reports, the mundane business of warfare punctuated by occasional bursts of excitement when someone made contact with enemy forces. Kestrel divided her attention between her instruments and the world outside her canopy, scanning for threats, staying aware of the tactical picture that the AWACS controller was painting over the radio. An hour into the patrol, her radar warning receiver chirped, a brief illumination from a ground-based radar that disappeared almost immediately. She marked the location, noted it on her kneeboard, and continued her scan. The enemy was probing, testing, trying to understand the aerial presence without revealing their own positions. It was a chess match played at 300 knots, each side trying to gain advantage without committing to a move that couldn't be taken back. Then the radio crackled with urgency, a ground controller's voice tight with stress. Any CAS, Hammer 2-1 is taking fire from concealed positions. Grid November Victor 317428, request immediate air support. Kestrel was already banking toward the coordinates before the transmission finished, dice forming up on her wing without needing to be told. She switched frequencies, contacted the ground controller directly. Hammer 2-1, Halo 2-1 flight, 2 A-10s with full combat load 5 minutes out. Describe your situation. The ground commander's voice came back clipped and professional despite the sounds of gunfire in the background. Halo, we're a mechanized infantry platoon, taking fire from elevated positions to our north and west. Enemy appears to be dug in with automatic weapons and possibly RPGs. We're trying to maneuver, but the terrain limits our options. Need you to suppress those positions, so we can either advance or withdraw. Kestrel rogered the call, her mind already running through attack options, considering angles of approach, thinking about collateral damage and rules of engagement, and the 100 other factors that made close air support as much art as science. She descended to 5,000 feet, low enough to get good visual identification, but high enough to stay out of effective range of small arms fire. The ground fight became visible as she approached, armored vehicles in defensive positions, tracers reaching out from the hillsides, the organized chaos of troops in contact. She rolled in on the northern position first, identifying what looked like a machine gun nest partially concealed behind rocks and sandbags. Her targeting pod locked onto the position, feeding data to her weapons systems, and she armed her gun. Hammer 2-1, halos in from the south-northern position. Confirm friendly positions are marked. The ground controller came back immediately. Friendlies are marked with infrared strobes. All hostiles are north of our position. You are cleared hot. Kestrel steadied her aim, compensated for wind and altitude and the 1,000 tiny variables that affected where her rounds would impact, then pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 sang its song of destruction, and she watched through her targeting pod as 30 mic rounds impacted the enemy position, saw the machine gun go silent, saw secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off. She pulled up and banked hard right, giving Dice room to make his run on the western.